Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming and being with us. Obviously, the fact that you come from a broad range of places reflect the interest in this conversation. For those of you who don't know, Center for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research, we are British Army's own independent in-house think tank. We do a series of research as well as publications, lectures such as this. The last one was on the future of ISIS. The next one is on the book War in 140 Characters. There'll be more information on the next event shortly. We issue documents and briefings, and you can pick up some of our publications here at the front, ours in Athena, which collects our occasional publications. And if you have missed some of our lectures and publications, you can access them on the AKX or email to us. And you can sign up to our monthly emails, either under the Global Analysis Program, which gives you an overview of key developments in the world, or also Chase's own monthly newsletter, which keeps you up to date with our activities and outputs. As far as notices go, today's event is going to be on the record, so whatever is being said from here, you'll be able to tweet, share, and tell that to your cousins and friends. We'll also record it, so we might actually make it public as well. However, the question and answer time is going to be off record, so that's actually when we encourage you to think through questions that you want to ask and get ready for that in a lively discussion. So today's topic is urban warfare. The future is here. I like that expression, the future is here, because there's a tendency to think about urban warfare as something in the future. In other words, that's the direction of the wars that we are set to be fighting. But actually, if you look at the trajectory backward, in other words, last 10 years, there's been an increasing number of episodes and theaters where actually that has been the fact. And recently, in operations in Syria and in Iraq, that has been urban warfare as we understand it. But it isn't just us in the coalition that faces those. Other countries are also facing similar challenges. We have observed in the Philippines how the fight against an ISIS network there became an urban warfare scenario that they were not really geared towards. We have seen that in Turkey when the PKK militants tried to declare independence and the Turkish military was caught off guard by it, and we've observed how their responses have worked. But we also see militaries being pulled into regular policing. In the Brazilian example recently, the Brazilian army being asked to help operations in certain parts of the Rio. But even perhaps in the British example as well too, when our own soldiers are being asked to contribute to policing efforts in moments of crisis following a terror attack. In other words, the urban aspect of the operating theater that we face is not something about the future. It's here. It raises a lot of ethical questions, a lot of tactical questions, and a lot of strategic questions. And so how we train for that, how we internalize that is going to be fundamentally important for what we do from now on. And we are thrilled to have our friends from the Modern War Institute based at West Point. There's an identical institution like ours that has a similar task to help the conceptual development of the U.S. Army. They joined us today. We ran a couple of events this morning. This is the third one today and the last one. And please come and introduce yourselves, and they're a really interesting and insightful group of people. They just released a really fun book called Strategy Strikes Back: How Star Wars Explains Modern Military Conflict. So I'm looking forward for the Lord of the Rings or maybe Game of Thrones versions on the horizons as well. They're very creative, and their website and their outputs are full of amazing and helpful information, including their podcast, The Spare, which tells the story of combat experience. In fact, if any of you want to be interviewed by them for their podcasts, John Amble, who's here at the front as the editor, will be more than happy to talk to you. Today's speaker is Major John Spencer. I first realized John on Twitter, reading his articles and engaging with him before I visited the Modern War Institute at West Point. And since then, I've been paying attention to a lot of what he writes and he has said. He has a unique insight, both as a soldier who's been in the U.S. Army since 1993 at various capacities, and at the moment as the Deputy Director for the Modern War Institute. His full bio has been in the information that you see for this lecture, but he holds a Master of Policy Management from Georgetown University and a BA from University of Maryland, and he is also a graduate of the Army's Command and General Staff College, and he has published a lot of articles, including in New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and NY Daily News. So he engages both with the public and the military. He will speak for roughly up to 40 minutes, give an overview of the questions and challenges and some of the opportunities, and I'll then join him for a brief discussion on the platform, and then we'll open it up for your questions and answers. Hopefully we'll have half an hour or so discussion with you as well. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Zia. Hopefully they don't mind I move around and the camera catches me with my hands in my pocket. I kind of do that. Hopefully my army doesn't see that. I'm really honored to be here and to be invited, and especially to speak to such a big group. I usually like to tell a little bit about myself, not one because my wife says I like to talk about myself, but I like to tell the urban story of how I got to here. I am by no means an urban expert, because I don't think there are many. I'm a student of urban warfare and urban operations generally. I talk a lot about warfare because it's probably the highest priority that we should be talking about, but I also talk about urban operations just in general, because the military, as we find, is asked to operate in the urban space, whether they want to or not. So I joined the Army in 1993 as a private, and I made it to Sergeant First Class, and then I went to OCS, so I didn't go to West Point. What that means is that most of my NCOs just thought I knew how to do their jobs, so it started off a little rough. I joined as a platoon leader to 173rd, and I jumped into Iraq in 2003 for the invasion. And I was 12 months on the ground as a platoon leader. We jumped into the north, which I was surprised is not desert. It's actually snow, wet, green mountains. Very surprised when we hit the ground. And moved south, and we were in Kirkuk for a little bit of urban, but mostly we're pushed out into their hinterlands, into places like Hawija, living on the sides of water treatment plants, and very village type of operations. Not much urban. I redeploy, I do all the things that Army things do. I go back into Iraq as an infantry company commander in 2008, and was sent to Baghdad. And many of you may know, Baghdad is very big, has many districts. I was sent to an area called Sadr City, and it was during the uprising of the Shia militia, Jaish al-Mahdi, and there was a fight called the Battle of Sadr City. So I was flown into combat, and the company commander I was relieved, and I was put in really shortly thereafter during the fight for Sadr City. And in the fight for Sadr City, we discovered an urban tactic that had been used a long time ago by falling on top of it. So if anybody knows how the Battle of Sadr City unfolded, we put a wall around them. We basically brought siege warfare to them and walled them in with concrete walls by putting them in every night. So a 6-ton T-wall, and then literally circled a city of 2 million. Because we weren't politically, which is very important as military strategists, it was no longer politically feasible for us to go into the urban environment to do what we wanted. We couldn't go inside. So we walled them in and then controlled the in and outs to reduce the violence and achieve our outcomes. I redeploy, I go off to a certain fellowship, and as a major, I was assigned to the CSA or CGS for you guys, the Strategic Studies Group, so a small think tank that General Odinero in 2013 stood up, and a group of 20 people, colonels and majors, were put together and said, okay, look at any problem that I'm not thinking about. So you take a full year and you do research for the chief, and what was discovered is that the theme of the group would be megacities. So a megacity, by definition, is any city with 10 million or more. All right, there's roughly 30-ish around the world. They're really big cities. So that was decided upon by the group to be the theme on which we would do research. And then we all competed against each other to what would be the research question that we would do. And we put in our names in a hat. And I wanted to be a part of the actual megacities group because they got to travel the world. They went to megacities. So they went to Bogota, they went to Dhaka, they went to Mexico City, and studied the city directly. I now know that it's good that I didn't get what I wanted, and I got force design and force structure. So as an infantry major at that point for like 18 years, I got the fun of studying for a year force design and force structure. Literally, how do you design a military and for what? But I have used that every day since. So we came out with this big report. You can look it up on megacities, which is really, I'll talk a lot about the trends that we talked about in that report. My report on how to make the Army smaller and do more was kind of pushed off to the side. We kind of looked at megacities, but as people that do research, sometimes they don't do what they're told. So it was just pushed aside. I moved to West Point, and we stand up the Modern War Institute. And we put out a lot of articles, daily articles, and unfortunately there's going to be a lot of shameless plugs because I wouldn't be allowed to come here if I didn't do my shameless plugs. So on our website, nwi.usma.edu, we put up daily articles. And I put up one article about concrete. And I basically explained that if you went to Iraq from anywhere from 2006 to 2008, you put up concrete. And it wasn't just for the fight for Sadr City. We put up concrete everywhere. I mean, as an infantry commander, I knew everything there is to know about concrete. There's, Jersey, Texas, Alaska, T-wall, everything. What type of crane you need. I became a concrete expert, and I'm not. That's for us. That'd be the engineer, right? But we did it every day because that's how we stopped. Reduced the IEDs. We created safe neighborhoods by walling in neighborhoods, and it was a very effective. So the article is the most effective weapon in modern war was concrete. Well, the article got 100,000 hits. It was picked up by Business Insider, by Vice News, by National Geographic Education. So I told my wife I'm not a smart man, but I listened to demand. So although megacities was kind of pushed off to the side, there's a lot of interest on urban, and it's not just in the military because urban is important. And I'm going to present it in an argument, and don't because I'm in the U.S. military, I'll criticize my own military, and there's some goods. But don't think that I'm telling you what the answer is. I'm actually presenting an argument, and hopefully I'm convincing. So we are now a urban species. So Homo urbanus. So about 10 years ago, the world became 50% or more, so a majority urban. About 2008, depending on what time frame. The estimates in 2030 will be 60%. In 2050, will be 75% urban. So what I like to tell people is you can run, but you can't hide from the urban. But that number of 50% is almost misleading. It's because 50%, that's not bad. Half the time I'll be in rural areas. I mean, that's the entire globe. So that's counting major countries with almost no urban, like Africa and large swaths of uninhabitable areas. Most of the developed world is over 80% urban. And that's not a bad thing because urbanization is usually synonymous with development and growth. Urbanization and technology are synonymous with growth. Well, the problem is, according to the UN, 90% of the growth in the world is happening in the 47 least developed countries. So I'll let you hold on to that one for a minute. But we ask, of course, why is the world going urban? And it almost is common sense. Like I said, it means growth. We don't need as many people in the rural area farming. People move to the urban for a better life, for jobs, for family. The urban spaces are the economic engine of nations. But why the sudden explosion? Why so fast? And that's one of the trends that we in the SSG and I've tagged onto in trying to make a convincible story is urbanization is not bad, but rapid population growth and rapid urbanization can lead to bad things. So rapid population growth is the other trend. So it took us about 1,000 years to get to the first billion people on the planet. And it took us about another 250 years to get to 3 billion. Well, then from 1960 to 1999, 39 years, we tripled that. We went from 3 billion to 6 billion. And then in another 12 years, we added another billion. So now we're about 7.1. They think that that'll level off eventually for certain reasons. But that's surge for a global trend person. That's a major surge in population growth that stresses all systems. So not just the military, it stresses all systems. And if I just said that the UN recognizes that all that population growth has really been in urbanization and really been in underdeveloped worlds that now can't necessarily sustain that type of growth. And billion, so I like to use my startling factoids because they're supposed to help tell my story, right? Billion is some people have in my master's programs. Some people just can't imagine what that number means or any big number. I mean, I can give you an analogy of us all holding hands around the globe and how many times I don't try. But a smaller number is 180,000. So 180,000 people move to a city per day. And when I read it, it might have been a typo or something. That's a fact. 180,000 people move to urban spaces a day. And they're moving to places that may not be able to sustain that growth. So what you see is in the underdeveloped countries, you see massive urbanization, massive population movement there. And some of that's good and some of it's bad, where they're moving to places and creating mega slums. So India, and most people here know more about India than I do, but 1 out of 6 people live in some type of slum in India. And slum just means, somewhere the United Nations, somebody doesn't view as inhabitable to certain health conditions. This is an example. So what you have is you'll have slums slapped up against high rises, up against income disparity. So people with money, people without money, has and have-nots. So these trends lead to other trends which, for a military person, become very important. So most of the world's megacities are littoral, and that's no surprise. Either why do major cities pop up on littoral areas? Because they need those lines of supply, they need those natural resources, but they are become vulnerable to natural disasters. And sometimes that's a military problem, sometimes it's not. But we've seen a 5-time increase, whether you believe in global warming or not. And that's, some people, my boss said that you can't argue it, and some people do. There's about a 5-time increase in the last 20 years in natural disasters and the impact to the urban spaces. And they're on the coast. They're vulnerable to natural disasters. And that kind of matters to military. Like I said, I talk across the spectrum. So what puts the military force, what's going to force us into the urban environment might not be warfare. It might be humanitarian aid and relief that turns into warfare, which is historical. But it is a concern to watch. And like I said, they're already stressed environments. So, and by stressed, we have a term that most people, if you study international relations, already know, failed state. That's kind of a common note. It wasn't until I went to a couple conferences that most people don't know about the term feral cities, which is basically failed state for a city, right? It's an undergoverned space where rule of law is not at a certain level. You have slums, you have bad things happening. They're almost failed cities, but they call them feral cities, and some people don't like that term. But when you have that type of urbanization, that type of population stress on a state or city government that is already stretched to govern their own people, and when you have that type of poverty, you start to have problems. And by problems, I mean violence. So, and we're seeing this globally. And recent studies have shown, so not only we are urban species, but now violence is an urban phenomenon. So globally, violence is now occurring more in urban spaces than it is rural. Almost seems like common sense, right? And that violence covers everything, crime, to vandalism, to the political. And that matters to the military because we are called for national security. As Zia talked about, a good example is Rio. So Rio's, if you know what happened there, in the favelas, and the favelas for the longest time were fine with some self-governance and shared relationships and partnerships, and whether it's Western ideal of okay, it maintained a certain level of stasis. Something happened, which is a good research question. What happened? Some people believe it was the Olympics, and a drive of resources into an environment upsets its stasis. I like to show the flooding example because we think that that's a bad thing, but there are many megacities that get flooded all the time, and their stasis of low levels of poverty doesn't change. They're really bad before the flood, and not much changed. But we view it as our Western ideals of they need help. So Rio had a stasis, something happened, and it got out of control. So the military wasn't not just asked. They were initially asked. The military was then given control. Like, you now have control of security in Rio. And as a student of military design, they're definitely not designed and definitely not trained for that. But just like for other operations, we don't get a choice of the missions we're given. We're a can-do organization. All of our military organizations are. So if I get asked to move in and provide security, I will, to the best of my ability. And usually I'm asked because I have the resources. So it's not just the infantryman that can stand guard on the checkpoint or that can do the raids, but it's the logistical resources, the medical resources. So the Army is, and we have many examples for us in Haiti and Operation Sandy for New York City, where we get asked to help just because we have the most amount of resources. But more importantly, I think what hopefully will come out in the questions, and I'll try to cover from the strategic to the tactical, and if I don't, please ask in the Q&A. I get criticized because I'm an infantryman. I've been in infantry for 25 years. I love to talk tactical, and I love to challenge assumptions in the way we do things. But I also teach strategy at West Point, so I can get down and dirty with that too. So violence is becoming a world phenomenon, but now political violence has become an urban phenomenon. So that's insurgency, terrorism, revolutions has become an urban phenomenon. And there's a good friend of mine that came out with a book I highly recommend it called Out of the Mountains, where he makes an argument on why that's happened. Why do guerrilla forces move from the mountains into the urban spaces? Because it provides them that security they need, the ability to hide amongst the population. I like his book, and his book does go through all the trends I just did. Not that I stole them. It goes through all those trends, and then he gives case examples of Mogadishu and a couple other examples. I like another example, which is General Kulak, who came up with the concept called a three-block war, which you'll hear if you study urban operations. The three-block war, which means you're going to on one block have a fight, a really nasty fight. On another block, you're going to have to help with humanitarian aid, and on the next block, you're going to be building back up stuff that you tore down. Paraphrasing, of course. Well, the same guys in an interview at CNN, and this is before what we've seen in the last 10 years, said the enemy has watched CNN. So the enemy knows how we operate. And he was talking more of Persian Gulf, Desert Storm. He says that the enemies of the future won't be the sons of Persian Gulf, Iraq. So they won't be the sons of Iraq. And I know different sons of Iraq, but he said they won't be the sons of Iraq in the Persian Gulf. They'll be the grandchildren of Chechnya. And what he meant by that is that the enemy has watched on how you can defeat a powerful military. If not defeat, at least buy time and achieve some type of political outcome. So ISIS is the example, right? ISIS moved into Mosul, and we can talk specifics, and recognizing that if they can get in there quickly, just like the Chechens and just like many other people, the urban space offers any enemy, and it can be as small as possible, an immense advantage, not to defeat a military, but to raise the bar of the symmetry and to gain an advantage to where you can come and take that land, which is what I do. I take land and I back from people that aren't supposed to have it, but it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you in a lot of ways. So where does that leave our military? So if political violence, the enemy has learned to pull us into urban spaces, where does that leave us as a military, especially as a strategist? So here I'll talk the strategy. Throughout time, the strategists, all the ones that we teach, Sun Tzu, right? So I'll paraphrase Sun Tzu, who said the best strategy, right, is to defeat the other guy's strategy. And he had multiple things. And this last one is, and I'm paraphrasing, was about cities. And he said, just don't do it. Yeah, that's what he says. And Clausewitz talks about the capitals and things like that. But for the longest time, the military strategy was don't go into the cities because you lose all your advantage. If you even go back farther in history, people will argue, we've been doing urban warfare since militaries have been around. The reason you have militaries is because of urban warfare. Because you had a castle, which is a city within walls, and the reason they built the militaries was to move forward and engage the person who was coming to siege your castle and engage him on the field of battle. That's why we have an army. We engaged in siege warfare for a long time, which is why it's good to watch Game of Thrones. And they'll say, we've been doing this for a long time, but I argue we have not. And my good friend Dr. Anthony King's in the room, and I steal from his book, which is I highly recommend as well, about combat soldiers, is that throughout the history of warfare, we have fought for cities but not in cities. So, and that used to be the strategy. If you could threaten the city strategically, then you could achieve your political outcome and they'll cede it. Because nobody wants to fight amongst their people. If they're a king, a president, or whatever, I don't want to fight inside my cities. All my people will die. And you could argue whether that's still a strategy today if people use cities as a strategic deterrence. And if you talk about soul, so one of in the mind of a strategist, soul matters. Because within the first certain number of minutes, the number of million people are going to die, we know that. And the number of our people are going to die. And we put them, so is that used as a strategic deterrence, city fighting? Because you don't want to have battle in there. So if warfare, if I believe that, has happened for cities, not in cities, has something changed? Like I said, the world is going urban. Can we continue to do that strategically? And strategically, like I said, and I teach strategy, so your national strategic interests, the military will be asked to help enforce. Many of them, number one is survival, right? So survival of your capital, survival of your political base. The number one interest of yours is survival. And then the number two usually is that economic. If I just said your cities are your economic engines of your nation, they're pretty important to you. And I don't argue that we've never had urban combat, and there's never been, and there's something coming, and I agree that the future is here. So this is Stalingrad, and that's usually the case study. It's Stalingrad, put it up in front of me, and I had to take the time, and I had to study it, and like many people that study, and again, I'm a student, most people don't understand that Stalingrad, 80% of it was destroyed by aerial bombardment before the battle started. And I don't think that we'll have any Stalingrads in the future. I don't think that people are going to, although it was an accident, they didn't plan to have operations there, that we're going to have hundreds of thousands of military against another hundreds of thousands military. And they didn't want to have that. But the 80% of it was destroyed in the initial bombardment, and then that caused the problems, which we'll talk about. When you rubbleize something, then you still got to go in there and clear people out. Did you just cause problems for yourself, which is what happened. You can't drive your tanks over rubble, most rubble, and then now I don't have my tanks, which is very important in urban combat. Hue, 1968, Vietnam. I actually love this case study because I argue today that they had better weapons, the U.S. military had better weapons for urban combat back then than we do today. All right? And there's a really good book called Hue, 1968 by Mark Bowden, and he walks you through how that commanders made decisions looked at what resources he had, and he called in these resources based on his limited knowledge of urban operations. But he had CS gas, he had flamethrowers, he had Zippo flamethrowers, which are tanks that are flamethrowers. He had ADA weapons that he just turned into buildings, punch holes through buildings. He had better weapons than we had today. Fallujah, 2004. This is actually, I just did an interview last night, and people say, do you want to use Stalingrad as your example? Like, no, I don't want to use Stalingrad as my example. I want to use Fallujah. So I like using Fallujah just like Sandhurst City. Fallujah 2004 was a really bad urban battle. I wasn't there, but I've talked to people that are there. I've read the history, and it's a good example of the assumptions that we have about urban warfare. I get, like I said, not everybody believes in me. I get a lot of resistance from Army senior leaders that say that when the time comes, I'm going to assume that a certain amount of destruction is okay. I'm going to assume that I can get the people out of there. But history doesn't tell you that. So Fallujah is a great example of we did everything we could on multiple passes to remove people out of there. And so that way, the only thing that's left on my playing field is bad guys. If you're still there, you're a bad guy. That never works. In Aachen in World War II, the Germans cleared it and we cleared it multiple times, and there are still thousands of people in there. Because some people just won't leave. In America, it's because they're pets. They don't want to leave their pets. They just won't leave, and you'll still have civilian casualties. But what's more important, and I never forget this as a strategist, that war is an extension of policy. We want to fight the fight that we want to fight in the way we want to fight it. I've trained to fight this way. I can tell you how most urban battles will be fought because I'm an infantryman. I fire and maneuver. I'm going to bomb the heck out of a building and move in and clear it. But they tried that, and they were very good at it, and they were being very destructive, and it became, in the information age, a big issue, and politically it became no longer feasible to take your current approach, and they had to pull out. That's my urban example of the future, is that we assume we're going to be able to do it in a certain way because if you ask for me, stuff's going to get broken. And that may not be politically feasible, and that's our job as military, is to give the policymakers options. So this is not opposed. So we get to military capabilities. Talk about strategy. Now let's talk about capabilities. Because as I learned, and this is where all my force design and force structure came in, as I learned that all that I knew about how we form our armies, divisional, BCT, squads, it's all irrelevant. It's all about force packages of capabilities, whether it's infantrymen, medical, artillery, and we package them in different ways, in different scale. You want to be able to break them apart. We have a puzzle piece, analogy. It's all about capabilities. So this is an example, a good representation of U.S. military capabilities. This was an actual show of force in Eastern Europe, and you know who it was for, but to say, hey, we're big, we're strong, here are our capabilities. there's almost nothing here that I would want for my urban warfare except for the tank. And even the tank, because I view every city as different, that tank may help me and it may not. Just based on the vertical distance that it can go up, based on the systems it now has, based on the number of rounds it can carry now. It may not be if I don't have any choice, I want to make sure I have tanks and I make sure I have infantrymen. And we learned in history what happens like Suez City when you go in with tanks without infantrymen or when infantrymen go without tanks. If anything, if I get to design my own unit, it would have tanks and infantry. The airborne, there's no capability, and I argue this, and somebody said push back, and I don't mind being pushed back. There's no U.S. capability designed for the urban environment. Now, we've adapted, and we've made adaptations. You could say that the MRAP's not. You could say there's certain urban survival systems that we put on our vehicles that are. But when I talk about capabilities, and I'll talk about when I get to the so what, which my wife says I can talk. I never get to that part, but hopefully I can get to that part. I'm painting a story here, and hopefully I'm convincing you, but then I got to talk about the so what. Major Spencer, you're a smart guy. What do you think we do about this? Nothing here is designed, and now that I know from force design is that no matter what you do and the modifications you do to your military, especially the U.S. military, because I studied it, we are designed specifically for a certain enemy in a certain location. And we actually have war games, and there's only a few of them, and we fight the highest risk, most probable war game we can, so that we build our army against what we believe is a really bad scenario, and they're all secret level. But I can tell you, legitimately, none of them involve us fighting them in the city. We don't want to, right? The strategy throughout time has been isolate or bypass the city, destroy your enemy at a range of your choice, and achieve your military objective. But I just told you that if I'm an enemy, that's not what I want to do, so why would I do that? I'll let you come on into the city. But we design them for other environments. And my kids are in elementary school, we also design them for the test. So if you ever want to question what a military is designed to do, yes, we're all designed for all environments. And that's what, argument here at the BCT, it's general purpose. It's supposed to be for every environment possible. Matter of fact, it's designed for a certain enemy in a certain fight, which is the highest risk, high-end combat. And then it's expected to be able to flex and adapt to other environments, other conflicts, with, the risk is lower for catastrophe. We have the high risk. And what I say is that the urban is different. And I argue that. And that's the argument within my military, is that urban is not something special. I argue that it is. So this is the biggest urban training facility in the United States. It's in the desert. And I can talk a lot about this and what I see just based on my own urban experience, but we don't build desert training facilities in the woods by taking a lot of sand out to the woods. We don't build jungle schools in the desert by setting up greenhouses. But dang if we don't try to build urban spaces by putting buildings up in the desert or in the woods. And there's reasons for that, and I'm being jovial, but there's reasons for it. But I don't agree that we can't use a real city, portions of a real city, an abandoned city. But what I see here is I don't see the density that I just talked to you about. And that's another argument if you study urban planning, urban operations, is that I told you about the population growth and more people living, they're going vertical and subterranean. Is density has to matter. Los Angeles is a very big city. It's not very dense. It's spread out. All right, so in density, I talk 7,000 people per square mile or more. Manhattan, 68,000. Shanghai, it's in the 60,000 per square mile. That's a lot of people. So you don't have that density. You don't have any. I also see as an infantryman, I see cover there. In my experience for combat in an urban environment, I told you about this fight for Slaughter City. This would pretty much prepare you for Slaughter City. Now, you need some concrete, which I don't know why we don't train concrete. I'll talk about that in a minute, about studying our past lessons. But after the fight for Slaughter City, I got sent to another area of Baghdad called Adamiyah. And it was a different type of density. And it wasn't, because Slaughter City was built by Saddam for the Shias, and it's very blocked houses. You can drive down on most streets. But the first time I drove down the street, I couldn't drive my truck. And the first time I chased somebody for a firefight down an alley that I couldn't drive down or couldn't walk down was in combat. And I think that's wrong. It's one minor example, but this won't train you for density. This also won't train you for not having any cover. Sometimes people talk about Panama when they airfilled it into a soccer field right outside, and I've had this feeling where you get dropped, you come out of your vehicle, you get dropped, you look around, and no matter where you're going to go, there's not going to be any cover. So which side of a building do I pick and hope that this side over here doesn't have the snipers in it? You don't get that out there. So now let's get to the so what, since I've run out of time, and I promise I'll get to the so what. So, Mr. Smart Guy, what do you think we do about this? So I have 3 recommendations. Number 1 is that David Kilcullen wrote Out of the Mountains. If I wrote a similar book, it would be Out of the Woods. So the aversion to urban that has come from across time is in our militaries, all of our militaries, from the day we start. And there's reasons for that. But I can tell you, I mean, I was a Ranger School instructor. I was an infantryman in Panama. I can tell you about every type of tree that's in the woods. I can tell you what tree to stand behind. I can tell you how to set up your patrol base, how to move stealthily. I can tell you everything there is to know about, especially depending on what type of woods. I can't do anything for you for the urban. I grew up in the rural environments. I was never put in the urban space and then trained about survival in the urban space. What's the difference between an electric line and a gas line? Where can I get water? Where can I plug in my batteries and recharge them, which is a thing, I guess, now. You can steal a car battery and recharge your own batteries if you just have this one cable. They never gave it to me. We don't think urban. We need to come out of the woods. Do your training in urban spaces. So one of the other problems with this is that you haven't built any subject matter experts. So you can build a mega city in the desert. Go ahead. It's about they did the figures, it's $8 billion. It would take you 10 years to build, and it would simulate a mega city. I don't want a range that I can open and close. I want a certain level of expertise in our militaries. And to do that, you have to commit resources to an environment. So for the U.S. military, we have a jungle school, an Arctic school, a desert school, a mountain school, just about a school for everything except urban. And we might build this. There's a plan to build this up, make it really big, and call it the Urban Training Center. But if you don't fill it with experts, and that's how all of our schools developed, were people that came back from combat and learned the lessons from a certain environment, whether it's the jungles of Vietnam or the Philippines, and they come back and they have that information. They stand up a school to train other people, and it builds, just like in academics of Sandhurst, you build knowledge by trying to teach somebody, and you record that knowledge, and you build experts that then flow into the military. We don't do that for urban. Our training for urban is enter and clear a room. That's all we need, right? So we're going to blast a building as much as we can to cover ourselves while we're moving, enter and clear the room, and just repeat. And enter and clear every building, every room, and that's not going to work in a 70-story building. And again, Dr. Anthony King's book was flabbergasted when I found out that my profession, the enter and clear a room, Battle Drill 6 for us, which I'm very proficient at, was not evolved over the history of time. It didn't come to us from other people being challenged by urban environments, Battle Away, Manila, Seoul, none of them. It came to us after the failed Munich raid of trying to save the Olympians went really bad, and they stood up certain counterterrorism organizations which developed that ability to go into a confined space and eliminate enemy or save hostages. And it went from the special community into the general purpose force, and now but if you ask somebody, I'm going to do some urban training. Yeah, I'm going to go enter and clear this, building by building. And then concrete gets me back to concrete. So you didn't build any expertise and you lost the lessons. So out of the woods and study the past. So I wrote that article that got 100,000 hits, which is great. I love the attention. But I was both surprised and saddened when Mosul, and this is early before the whole east side fell, called me, the CJTF OIR called me and said, we'd like to talk to you about your concrete article. So they wanted me to get on Civets and talk to me about my concrete article. I'm like, what are you going to talk to me about? There's nobody in Mosul that had ever used concrete. And there was concrete there that the enemy was using to their advantage. And they didn't know that what we had used the concrete to do was to bring siege to them. Matter of fact, siege warfare, which is a separate topic, is not in our doctrine. It might be in yours. It's not in mine. I've looked. The word siege is not in my doctrine. But that's what we do now. So if you look at any of the battles that have happened, urban battles that have happened recently, I can tell you how they all play out, and I'll tell you how the next one's going to play out. But somebody gets in there first and holds it, and you got to go get them. And almost every battle, you talk about Mosul, Aleppo, Marwa, they ended up sieging it in some way. So in Mosul, they had to siege it with 100,000 people. That's how many of the coalition of Iraqi security forces that they had. They sieged the whole thing, and then that's when they started to get gains, and then they started pushing in. So, 5 minutes ago. So I'd like to see an operation where you move, you have to take the city and you overnight put up a concrete wall, which can't be done overnight because you only get about 60 in a night. But if siege is the way we're going to approach the cities, then how do we train that at the operational level? So out of the woods, study the past, even the British lessons, I've studied them, and the British taught us how to number buildings with conflict in Ireland, how to identify, how to know where you are in the urban space, even if you can't read the road signs, about numbering buildings, and we use that today. Many lessons, the lesson that they learned in the tactic that they end up using in Mosul, and we'll probably get to it in question and answer. So I say for our fight, in the counterinsurgency with some high-end fighting, the concrete wall is the most effective weapon. In Mosul, the bulldozer was the most effective weapon because of the VBIEDs. Yes, JDAMs and joint munitions was very important, but the bulldozer ended up being the most effective weapon. Oh, that's not new. Israelis have been using that. There's many other people that use it because people barricade the roads. That's normal. You can plan that people are going to barricade the roads to stop you and ambush you where they want to. You have a bulldozer, they can't do that, and it's really hard to stop a bulldozer. The last one is, I think we need an urban lens. So there's no urban school in my military. There are no urban experts. I don't consider myself an urban expert. And there's about 3 people that I know in the U.S. military of 100, a million people, depending on how you count it, that have been given the autonomy to study urban for an extended period of time. And I've only been doing it for about 3 or 4 years. But I go to lots of conferences on urban, and I went with Dr. King, and there's like 4 guys, and there we are. We usually sit together because we get asked to go because we write and we study this. We have no experts. We have to commit resources, not just physical resources, but mental resources for the urban space. We have to develop urban experts. And it's not just in urban warfare. And that's the other thing about cities. Now that I understand cities, because I kind of bounce between historical urban operations and understanding cities. That's what the Megacities report said, is we need to treat cities as its own unit of analysis. If you believe in the analogy that which urban planners have been using across time, is that cities are organisms, living organisms. They have flows of vital things that have to go in just like an organism does. They need food, water, resources, and they have waste that has to come out. If I use the analogy of the human body, and it has errors, and there's been people that pointed it out to me. If I lay a human body down on an operating table, I'm going to ask a medical professional to come in, and he's going to operate on that person. First thing he's going to do is set that human up to vitals. He's going to monitor their vitals, so no matter what operation, even if he's doing an amputation, he's monitoring the vitals of that living organization, so he knows how to respond to it. We don't know how to do that in cities. So some people say, and I know you guys will say in your military, like, even if my military was 5 times as big as it is now, how do I do an operation in a megacity? There are megacities in the Pacific region, the Shanghai corridor, that are now getting up to, because they're connecting to 80 million people. Not possible. Well, I say as a military man, and I'm just a slow infantryman, is I don't get a choice where I go. You tell me to go in there and do a mission, I'm going to go in there and do a mission. And I don't believe that you can't, with even 1,000 military personnel, achieve a mission in a megacity. Well, and you got to tell me what the mission is. And it is possible to cut certain parts of cities off. New York City is easily cut off. You control the bridges. In Mosul, same thing. The bridges were vital. You can cut parts of cities off to make a big problem smaller. And if you're really good at concrete walls, you can make the whole city smaller and achieve a mission. But we don't understand cities because we avoid them. And either you believe in the global trends, or you're a strategist and you're thinking of the most probable high-risk environment. If I'm one of our enemies, I'm not going to fight us in the open plain for sure. I'm going to pull you into a city.
No, thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciated the historical references too, because obviously there's always a tendency to think a new development is really brand new, but actually you look back at the history of warfare. Even I loved your references on the siege and the castles and how people pulled into the city walls and etc. for defense. So there's certain things we learn from history, but obviously there are new aspects of it, the information aspect of it, the international media, the NGO side of it, connectivity. But are there also opportunities too? And I ask that in a sense that I think there's a sense that we only look at the liabilities of urban warfare, which are very clear. You're exposed to fire, cost to civilians, high military casualties. But there was an amazing video of a Syrian militant who connected 2 rifles to his laptop and defended a building's entrance on his own. So in other words, he generated mass in such a way that we wouldn't necessarily think it was possible. And he defended that building and entrance for a very long time. So is that actually also an opportunity that, in a sense, the same capacities that we think it provides to the opponent could also provide us with capacities for deception, for generation of mass beyond what we have understood it to be, and actually catching our own enemies' gravity points off guard? Yeah,
unfortunately, there's a lot more opportunity for the bad guy than there is for the good guy. And that's what we've seen in warfare, and Colonel Collins talked about this morning about the democratization of technology, where we saw that, militant people with not $100 to their name establishing autonomous systems like a sniper rifle that he can, from his coffee shop, engage and trigger, and they fire through buildings to engage their targets. You just don't know where it is. It's very scary for me. Same thing for the information space. A lot of times people get this idea of urban warfare in their mind, and they think Mosul. They think, and that could be right, but what happens when it's a technologically advanced city? Like Seoul. Seoul is one of the most connected cities in the world. I often tell people, don't visit New York City and spit on the ground. Well, you can spit, but don't do something wrong because you're always on camera. And we know that, so even in Seoul, there's more cameras. How do we use that to our advantage to achieve our military mission? And I agree with you in deception, and this is why I hate the fact that we're really bad at knowledge management. And I don't mean like the SIGO that needs to do knowledge management, is that usually there's an urban problem and somebody's faced it before, and we have a really problem of passing those lessons down. I mean, I took a highway and 3 exits to get into my zone when I was in urban combat. I had to go along the highway, and so we had to practice deception about sending multiple patrols in multiple directions. But what happens when you take your principles that we believe that work in the woods will apply to the urban, and some do, some don't. What happens is every tree has an eye. And he's watching you. Does it change the way your soldiers act? There's lots of opportunities for sure, Zia. But a lot of times it's an authority problem and it's a culture problem. Because culturally, everything we do in the military is usually there's a cultural aspect of it. And whether it still needs to be carried forward or not is the question. I can talk to it tactically, but even the approach of who's going to help us in the city. I have another idea about gangs of Baghdad. I've been watching too much Game of Thrones. I maintain security in my zone, but not my guys. I controlled 75,000, an area with 75,000 residents, and it wasn't mine at that point. It was the Sons of Iraq. But the Sons of Iraq were controlled by gangsters. They were criminals. I mean, some of them were IED in places, all that, and we knew that. So in the next urban space, and this is the one, the mental models that we have, METTC, we have them, political, military, economic information, like these variables which are supposed to help you understand every environment. Well, one of the things that's missing is power. Like, who controls the power? In Rio, it used to be the gangs, and it worked well. So if I was going in to do a mission, and the government may be who I'm talking to, but it could be the gang leader that can help me achieve my mission. And that's what we did in Iraq, in Baghdad. It wasn't the tribal Sons of Iraq. It was gang leaders that could put people on checkpoints that could maintain security.
And one of the points you mentioned, I think, which touched on some of my core questions about what comes after the fight. So obviously, our way of warfighting, rightfully so, has moral standards, legal standards, and precision focus. We don't want high civilian casualties. We don't want military casualties. We do our best. We have our boundaries. Sometimes things go wrong. Vis-a-vis the Russian approach, which is here's a barrel bomb, here's a chemical weapon, unprecision kind of bombing to force a civilian population out. But there's still the question of what happens next. So we've seen it in Raqqa, we've seen it in Western Mosul, IEDs that are left, the destruction of the city's infrastructure, and obviously the urban warfare preparation does not necessarily also prepare you for the third block you mentioned, which is repairing of that city so the civilian population can turn. Or you're opening the door for grievances, new insurgencies, new gangs, new criminality. In other words, a failed state, a failed city, a feral city you're leaving behind. In the long term, you're creating a continual problem. So how can you actually incorporate in your medical analogy, the fact that if you do a medical operation, you want to patch that person up and back them, bring to health. You don't want to just say, I took the stone out from your kidneys, but hey, you're still on the operating table. How does military planning accommodate that?
So I use the body as an analogy, which, some of my other, my two friends that are urban experts, not experts, but students say that your analogy doesn't work. It's really hard to kill a city. Historically, but I can kill a human really easy. It's really hard to kill a city, and there's very, very few that have not stood the test of time. But I use the analogy to say that we need medical professionals. They're experts on how to operate on a city. And every city is different, and every megacity is definitely different. But there are mental models that can help you understand the environment. So I usually say there's two challenges for a military office, military organization. One is understanding how to operate in an environment, and the other is understanding the environment. And they differ depending on what the mission is, but we're challenged in both. I use my concrete as an example. Just like you said, the weapon that helped me achieve my security outcome, which is number one, understanding now how cities work is that my hypothesis by emplacing those walls, millions and millions of walls, we cut off every natural flow of that city, which are very important to every cultural and social flow, every economic, where the markets are, all that. So my hypothesis is by achieving our security outcome with the walls and leaving them up and redesign that city, and it causes us to have to stay there longer. Because it can't get to natural states, which is what we've seen in Mosul. Cities are very resilient. And the east side of Mosul was up and everybody wants to publicize that. It was back up, not to its stasis. And that's the other problem is that military organizations want to look at how do we get it back to, and we did this in Iraq, back up to our Western standard. Well, let's start with what standard it was at before, and then get it back up to that stasis. So we need medical professionals that understand cities. So when we enter that phase of the operation, we're doing it smartly because we understand that the cities have this flow, they have powers, they have certain requirements to function as a city. And sometimes that fits into a hierarchy, and a lot of times it doesn't.
So maybe actually what we're discussing is the maneuverist approach, or even in your cement example, the siege that forces to contain the destruction of a city. Maybe in the Afrin operation recently, when the YPG militants eventually gave up the build-up to the urban warfare, when the Turkish military circled Afrin and they literally walked out with civilian population, is an example of how that siege could actually force a conclusion without a massive fight and destruction for the city.
Exactly. And a lot of people didn't like that tactic, but it's debatable. And what's your outcome? In violence? So did they all get out?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm this is a fascinating conversation.